Here are the violation descriptions, here are the codes, and here are the instances that we found in the database where an inspector had issued a violation. And we see that 101 times there was failure to report defective, insufficient, or improperly cemented casing within 24 hours or submit a plan to correct it within 30 days. In other words, industry knew their well was leaking and didn't tell anybody until an inspector came. That's the conclusion from that line. Well, so what? That could be months. It could be a year. Inspections don't happen every day. As you know, there aren't enough inspectors to go around. 41,381 wells in the last 13 years. You've read how many inspections each inspector has to do per week. They can't get to every well every year. So during that period of time when the well is leaking, the company knows the well is leaking, hasn't reported it, the well is leaking. And while it's leaking, it can be putting a contaminant into somebody's drinking water well and or methane into the atmosphere. And even when the inspector comes and says, your well is leaking, you failed to report it, I'm going to issue a violation, how long does it take to get fixed? Months? Weeks? Took the wells in Dimmick's 2 years before they even got the plugging done on the most egregious wells. 76 times improper casing to protect fresh groundwater, 81 times excessive casing seep pressure, and then a bunch of other things. So those are the violations that we found. Then we had to search through the violation comments. In other words, an inspector didn't issue a violation. Search through the failure comments. Inspector didn't issue a violation, but says in the report, the well is bubbling, bleeding, it's bled down, it's above the lower explosive limit, there's annular gas, there's annular vent, there's a cement failure, there's a casing failure, there's a casing patch, improper casing, gas migration, gas leak, top job, cement fail. All these are the kinds of words we find in the comments written by the inspector on wells for which there were no violations. Clear indication that the well was leaking, but no violations. All right, so then we just took the gross data, just as it was. No processing, no fancy statistics, no prognosis, no attempt to predict the future from the past. This is what we found. So now I give you a table. You show students tables in a 9, 10 in the morning class. And I'm showing you tables, it's what, 8 o'clock at night? Stay awake. All right, here's the year that the well was spud. Spud means starts to be drilled, starting in 2000 up to the end of 2012. Here are conventional wells. Everything other than shale. Here are unconventional wells, shale wells. And here are the totals. And here are the number of indications, either by violation or by comment, of wells that have failed. They're leaking. Here are the number of inspections that were done. Here's the percentage. You just take that number divided by that number, you get that number. So there were 26,915 inspections. There were 280 leaking conventional wells. 1.1, about a 1% leak rate. Pretty darn good. Unconventional wells. Well, there weren't very many of them until about 2006. By about 2009, things really sped up. When you have very few wells, numbers don't usually have a lot of meaning, but by the time you're down here, you notice, let's see, 2, 4, 7, 9, 5, 2. Now you could look at that and say, well, geez, they had a really bad year in 2010, they had a really good year in 2012. Wrong. How many times did the wells in 2012 get inspected? How many times did the wells in 2010 get inspected? More than once. So you can't draw any conclusions from this other than to say that the rate at which unconventional wells are experiencing problems is much higher than the rate at which conventional wells are experiencing problems. In fact, about 6 times higher. Well, why? Wait a minute, we just got through saying it doesn't matter whether it's a gas well, an oil well, a water well, you still got to drill the hole, case the hole, gasket the hole with cement. Why would unconventional wells be experiencing more distress, more loss of integrity than conventional wells? It's a rhetorical question, but we need to bind data to get information. So we're going to try to answer that question. That's just raw. There have been a number of papers written, reports and papers. In fact, a paper appeared this year in the journal Science, which is without doubt the most prestigious journal in all of science, called Science. Written by a professor at Pittsburgh and a professor at Penn State. They went into the same database we went into, and they did step 1. You remember the 3 steps I showed you? Step 1 is count the number of violations for loss of wellbore integrity. And they came up with 3% for Marcellus wells. And they published it in Science. They didn't get the whole story. Tonight you're going to hear the rest of the story. All right, so we have all this raw data. What can we learn from it? Are there geographical differences? Do wells in northeastern Pennsylvania behave differently than wells in Butler County? Why this apparent difference between conventional wells and unconventional wells? Why do we see that the rate at which unconventional wells are failing appears to start going up very precipitously and then drops off? How does that make any sense? Well, the second author on the paper, and the second author of our talk tonight, is a guy named, ready for this, Marty Wells, who happens to be the premier statistician and probabilist at Cornell. He's the guy, he's the professor at Cornell that everybody goes to for very difficult problems in probability and statistics. So he sat down with him about a year ago and said, Marty, how do we make sense out of all this data? How can we use this data over the past 12 years to predict well performance in the future? And he said, well, you use the Cox proportional hazard model. You all know that, right? Didn't you just use that last week? I'm sure you did. This is why you hire an expert in statistics and probability. So he learned us, he taught us about the Cox proportional hazard model, and here's all you need to know about it. It's a very sophisticated, standard, commercially available. You can get an app on your iPhone for it, and if you feed it data, observational data from the past, it interprets that data in such a way that in this case, we can predict the risk of cement or casing problems for wells with incomplete inspection histories from the behavior of wells with more complete histories. Which wells in that database have complete inspection histories? The right answer is 0, because how long do the wells have to last? Lori, where are you? How long do the wells have to last?
Till the life of the planet.
For the life of the planet. So do we have any wells with a complete inspection history? No. We have some wells with 1 inspection in 12 years, some wells with 3 inspections in 3 years. And from each of those inspections, we get information. But what this model does is allows us to predict future performance based on past performance in a statistically valid manner. We can tell you within a few percentage points what the expected value is and what the confidence is in that prediction. Plus or minus a standard deviation, 2 standard deviations, anything you want. All right, so now here we go. I told you this is a college class. You're about to see things. I'm making a prediction that nobody sitting in this room has ever seen a plot like I'm going to show you. Because I hadn't seen them 6 months ago. So I need to spend a minute or 2 explaining what I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you 5 graphs. On the horizontal axis of each one is what we call the analysis time in weeks. That's how long it would take if we were to continuously observe that well, a well, to exhibit or not exhibit this probability of failure. I'm going to let that sink in for a minute, then I'll say it again. The horizontal axis is time in weeks. So here's 4 years, 8 years, 12 years. And that's the time that we would be wanting to observe a particular well of a particular type in order to determine what the probability is that it's going to develop a leak. And that's the fractional probability. 10% probability, 20% probability, 30% probability, 40% probability. So that's, There it is. What I just said is what's in that paragraph. So I told you I'm going to show you 5 plots. So we can look at the data different ways. The wonderful thing about the Cox proportional hazard model is that you can ask it lots of questions. You could take dumb data, just looks like a bunch of numbers, and see patterns emerge. So here's the first one. This is all the data, the entire state. The 41,000 wells minus the 5,000 that had incorrect dates, minus the 8,000 for which we had no information. Old wells and new wells. We defined old wells as pre-2009 and new wells as post-2009. Because that's what the industry is telling us, right? They came to Pennsylvania, they started putting modern shale gas wells in your state, more or less in 2009, using the most modern techniques with the toughest regulations, best equipment, best material, best trained personnel. And so we said, okay, we noticed something. Cox proportional hazard model just discovered the first thing that we found interesting. Before 2009, which is before a lot of shale gas wells, the predicted rate of failure after about 13 years was about 2%. For all the wells drilled after 2009, by the time they get to about 4 years old, they're predicted to fail at nearly 38%. Lots of possibilities here. It could be the reason why these pre-2009 wells aren't failing at a very high rate. They're not being inspected anymore. They're conventional wells. If you're the PADEP director and you've got a very short staff of inspectors and you're drilling Marcellus wells like crazy, but you still have tens of thousands of older conventional wells, where are you going to send your inspectors? Then we said, okay, let's still look at all the data, and let's just look at all the old wells and separate out conventional and unconventional. So this is pre-2009, there are only a couple hundred shale gas wells, and that's these. So those pre-2009 wells are now nearly 5 years old, and those older wells are predicted to be failing at a rate of about 13%. Conventional wells still down here at about 2%. Then we went to post-2009. And again, strong difference between conventional and unconventional. Unconventional wells are always failing at a higher rate. Then we noticed something else in the data. Actually, Marty noticed it. Marty Wells noticed it. He said, you ought to take a look at the northeastern counties. And we define northeastern counties as these. And then we took the data and separated it into 2 bundles. One bundle is all the counties not in the Northeast, including Butler. And then the other bundle is all the counties, all the data in these counties. And again, what you notice is that for the rest of the state, failure rates are pretty low, even after 12 years. Over 50% in the northeastern counties. Skip that one. No additional information there, but here's the one that's, I think, the most telling. So this is Northeast County zone, and we're looking at old pre-2009 and new post-2009, because the industry kept telling us modern technology has solved the problem. And what we see is that for pre-2009, those wells now are, remember, these are shale gas wells. So they're on the order of 7 years old, oldest ones. Failure rate, close to 50%. Let me make sure you understand what this says. If you were to walk into any of the Northeast counties right now, put your finger on a well that has just been drilled, and somebody asked you, what's the probability that sometime in the next 7 years this well will leak? The answer is 48%. How do we know that? Because we've analyzed previous performance. Post-2009, for any equivalent amount of time that you're willing to wait, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, the rate of failure of the newer wells is higher. Somebody want to offer me an explanation for that?
How does the geology differ between northeast and southwest?
Excellent question. Substantially. How does the geology different? Why are we seeing this vast difference between northeastern Pennsylvania and the rest of the state? We'll come back to that during Q&A. I'm glad you asked. An important question. All right, how are we doing on time, by the way? Anybody want to go home yet?
Great.
How much more time can I use?
As much as you want.
As much as you want.
All right. So I'm going to make some observations and conclusions based on this part of the talk, which is remember the question we asked, you've got a water well and there's nearby gas well drilling. What's the probability that a nearby gas well is going to leak? Because if that probability is low, you don't worry so much. If that probability is high, you should worry some more. And what we determined, first of all, publicly available records, these are all in the public domain, indicate that the majority of older active wells are no longer being inspected. That's bad. We could be raising thousands of conventional wells, or still in production, going out of production, being abandoned, being plugged, hopefully not being lost. And since they're not being inspected, we don't know if they're leaking. Second observation, everything I just told you tonight depends on only one factor. How good is the inspection? If there's no inspection, there's no information. If an inspector goes to a well and habitually never writes a comment, no information.